Ash.
Rob.
Yeah, how's the no vegetables diet going?
No vegetable diet's going well. I have to confess that I've added in a carrot
Oh,
based on Stan Efferding, the guy who wrote the Vertical Diet, and he says that's if you're going to pick one vegetable, have one carrot.
a
So I have
carrot.
one
Why?
raw carrot. Um, I think retinol is the
Mm-hmm.
main ingredient that he thinks is
It's for sight, right?
yeah, exactly, vitamin A, I believe,
Mm.
and yeah. So, but to be honest, I haven't felt any different having the carrot or not. But otherwise, it continues to feel good. I've added in a few more carbs just because I'm doing a bit more training than I was. So more rice, a little bit of fruit juice. So orange and cranberry are my two favorites. Blood orange
Nice,
specifically
nice.
around training, and some highly branched cyclic dextrin,
Oh,
which
oh
is
god, yeah, I remember that. I used to have that.
carb powder. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. So I think that was inspired by Liam's podcast episodes.
Yeah.
We're just giving some numbers on how many carbs you should have when you're training, and I think I was on very much the low side of that. And considering I'm doing a bit more nowadays, I thought it would be a good idea. And yeah, I think I feel more energized for my training sessions, and otherwise feeling pretty good energy wise. So yeah, I'm looking to get my bloods done in probably the next couple of weeks, and that'll be interesting to see what they're looking like, considering I've probably had, I reckon on a high week I'll have 5 portions of vegetables in a week. That'll be a very high week, and mostly 0 to 1 most weeks,
Yeah.
but with fruits, like I said before.
How have you found, like, you've not been massively strict, have you? And you've eaten out quite a fair bit. Like I saw you eating burgers the other day, twice in a day, and so you're not like you're not eating like carbs or anything like that. Like, so obviously carbs, they had the burgers, they had the chips. So like you're not being like, I am not eating this because I follow this kind of diet. You're just mainly eating animal based. So you're mainly eating meat, organs, and some fruit. That's your general diet, and now carrots
And rice. Yeah,
and rice.
yeah, and rice. Yeah. So
Okay, so it's a little bit
yeah,
more towards like the vertical diet as a general. So a little bit more like, say, like the meat and the rice, because I think with an animal base, it's more. He does say obviously you can eat things like, say, rice, when like Paul Saladino and stuff, but it's like generally they're not really promoting carbs like that. It'll be more fruit.
yeah, yeah. So what was the question? Sorry. Like,
No, so I
what I'm
was
actually
just asking how, because obviously you're not being that strict, but you're being strict enough, so you're just following a guideline most of the time. Is that right?
yeah. So don't get me wrong. This is not a strict scientific experiment. This is more me playing with the notion that you can get your micronutrients from sources other than vegetables. So removing all vegetables, can I still maintain a good level of health and feel good in my training and everything else? And upping red meat, upping sort of organs and bone marrow, those sorts of things. The hypothesis is that covers all bases nutritionally, so you actually don't need vegetables. So I'm just seeing how I feel with zero vegetables, but
Yeah.
focusing more on getting my micronutrients from other sources. And so far, so good.
Nice. I'm really looking forward to seeing that information. I think after Liam's episode, like, it did make me realize that I'm probably not carbing up enough pre-training. Like most of the time, I like, because I train quite early in the morning a lot of the time. When I say early, it'll be like after like the morning classes or something like that, or after morning PT. So normally it'll be like after 9 o'clock. But I'll be lucky if I do get some breakfast before that, and if I do, it'll be like eggs and bagel or something like that. So it's not really that much. And then it just made me laugh, because then when he was like, yeah, people have like their carb-free pre-workouts and stuff like that with all the caffeine, I'm like, yeah, it kind of sounds a bit like me. So I'm after I come through, after this weightlifting prep is done, which will be next week. I plan on introducing a lot more carbohydrates into my pre-training to see if I can start getting that pump back and stuff like that.
How is training going?
Yeah, it could be better. Not gonna lie, I had obviously I had that COVID-y thing that was going around. Like, I was floored. So basically, it was like the severe flu where I couldn't stand up. Everything was horizontal. So I lost 10 days worth of training there. And so bear that in mind, out of an 8-week prep. So I lost 10 days there.
Mm.
And then I was just getting better. And then Chloe got ill. And because I sleep next to Chloe, she's like coughing in my face, stuff like that. And I thought I got away with it because the missus come down with something. And I then the next day, I trained on Monday this week. So that was like the start, like about 28th of April, or March, sorry, or whatever it was. And it was an all right session. I haven't trained at all this week, and I'm competing on Sunday. And I don't think I'm going to train again. So I'm just like, I have to ask myself, am I going to compete? Because like, I can barely lift an empty barbell without like my shoulder hurting or anything like that. This discomfort. So, and I know the type of person I am. As soon as I'm put in a competitive environment, all sense goes out the window, and I'm just like, fucking give me the heaviest bar I can lift. And because I like putting my like skills to the test on show, I love that. So I thrive in that environment. But I do have to be smart, because I have to think like, I feel I've done enough prep for the competition. I'm not going to be as good as I could have been, but I feel I've learned. I've gone from powerlifting, which is like slow and heavy, to like weightlifting, which is like fast and kind of heavy. And I feel I've managed quite good over the last 8 weeks, but I'm not feeling like, yeah, I'm ready for this competition. I'm just like, yeah, I'm all right. I'll get by. But cause again, you know, when you have an old self to compare against, like literally my last weightlifting competition, the only one I've ever done was at WIT. It was a virus event. And it was like, so that was literally the last time I'd done this, and I'm going back to the same place to do the same competition. So it's like, to me, not to compare to how I was in like peak CrossFit and weightlifting self is really hard, because I'm like, well, I'm stronger now, so surely that means I can lift more. But no, that is not the case.
It depends what you're doing it for, is the way I'd think about it. Like, what do you hope to get out of the competition? Because you're probably not going to set lifetime PBs. So what's the intended output? Is it fun? Is it see where you're at?
It was more fun. It was because it was like I needed direction to my training, and it was an 8-week 8-week time frame, and I was like, it's quite enough time to kind of get something back in and stuff like that, and see how it feels. And I wanted to work with Chris, so I thought it'd be a cool opportunity to work with Chris from Ronin and see how it goes. And it's gone really well. Like training wise, it's gone really well. I've learned a lot. I'm moving better. Like, it's been feeling great. But I now have to weigh up the thing of, if I do compete on Sunday, what's the risk of injury? And then how, if I do get injured, is that then going to impact me going forward? Because like you started BJJ recently, right? Haven't you been a lot more consistent with it, right? So like, how have you found your body is feeling quite resilient? Because obviously you do a lot of tennis, you do a lot of like multi-direction movements, you put your body into compromising positions. How have you felt your body adapting to BJJ?
Overall, good. I think because I do a lot of pulling in my training, that's been very helpful. Just because there's so much gripping and pulling on the gi. And well, I think the major areas that have felt the change is the neck, actually, just because you're obviously, someone's trying to rip your head off or choke you out. Your neck has to do a lot of work. So definitely getting a bit of DOMs in the neck feels very much like having played a rugby match. But otherwise, touch wood, the body feels reasonably okay, and just tired. I think because it's there's so many max effort moments when you're just fighting with all your strength to get into or out of a position against your opponent. So but overall loving it. I think the new sport, the new skills, feeling like I'm learning very quickly, lots of new information and putting it into action, and just rolling around on the floor with sweaty men is just brilliant.
Interesting.
But I think that's a nice little segue into what we want to talk about today. Most of you who follow Mat Fraser will probably have seen that one of the best CrossFitters of all time unfortunately injured his knee in a jiu-jitsu warm-up, and it was a pretty bad injury where he tore his ACL completely, also damaged his MCL and LCL, and put a tear into his meniscus. So
Hold
it's
on,
pretty
you said
comprehensive.
in a warm-up he did that?
warm up. Yeah, that's what he said on Instagram. So
So hold
I don't
on.
have many
So
details.
let me just. I'm just that injury in itself seems massively severe. And if I was trying to picture how that injury would happen, like forgetting about BJJ because I don't really know enough about it, but I can only imagine. I'm thinking of something like rugby and being tackled and having essentially someone fall on like the side of my knee and just to collapse in on itself and like literally snap. Like that's if I'm
Yeah,
picturing. Then if I put it into a BJJ scenario, how does that
yeah.
happen in a warm up? Like what? How intense are your warm ups?
They're hard work, like they're like
Yeah,
tiring, but this is what I was thinking as well when I saw it. I was just like, I can't imagine a situation where a huge amount of force would be placed on the knee in the right direction to do that amount of damage. So, there's a lot we don't know. So this is all conjecture as to what actually happened to his knee, but it does get you thinking. This guy was the best male CrossFitter. He's won more than anybody else, and CrossFit is the sport of general physical preparedness. So you'd hope he's probably one of the most robust and resilient athletes in all spheres. And it then begs the question, is there a gap in his training that's left him predisposed to the injury? And it's something I think about a lot because obviously I work with a lot of people who've got injuries or they're experiencing issues in their CrossFit training. And you start to see patterns for things that people are good at and things that people are not good at from a movement perspective. And I think something I reflect on often is, where are the gaps in the CrossFit, in a standard CrossFit program? What gaps are left unfilled, which leave people vulnerable to specific types of injuries when they do other things than just CrossFit, or even just doing CrossFit? Like, there are some patterns that build up over time, which eventually impact your ability to do CrossFit, the sport itself. So I think it's something we should dig into today for our episode.
yeah, because just might as well go straight in with that. When I think about CrossFit and like obviously the class environment, a lot of the things that we choose to do as a coach, like whether it's the warm ups or how it's programmed and stuff like that, you have to think about one, the is it fun? Because you want people to be
Mm-hmm.
coming back. Is it effective? So you obviously have to know what the measure is that you're obviously seeing if it's effective or not. But thirdly, you have to think, does this work in the box? Like, does this work in the space that we have? And does this work with the equipment we have? And if it doesn't, you're going to have to amend what you wanted to do to make it fit your space. So, like, obviously, some of the stuff that we'll go through, but like, for instance, my first point in mind is when I think about all the athletes and they get their game certificates, you notice all of their training changes. So they go from being very gym based, very like long in endurance based, like doing these big like triathlon and stuff, like getting their big engines, good baselines, and then suddenly they all start doing a lot of like odd objects, moving outside. Everything is like climbing shit, doing over like very like fun training essentially. What a lot of people would class as quite fun because it's very like real life, and you just understand because if you try to do that in a class, it's very hard because it just to coach that for a start. How do you coach? Let's climb this like netting and climb over the other side. And how are you going to get this netting? Do you know what I mean? It's just like I'm just thinking about like the assault course that they did. Obviously, they're trying to be ready for anything, and it's like those sort of like different like change of directions, body movement things. It's a big ask for a CrossFit box, but you know CrossFit's methodology and you go through its key physical traits that it wants you to cover. It includes a lot of this movement. It includes being outside. It includes playing sport. So it's like, why is CrossFit missing it? Or is it the box's programming that's missing it? And why? And what's it missing?
Yeah. Yes, I think in terms of, if you distill it back to the original sort of journal articles that describe what fitness is and what we should be aspiring to, it's brilliant and it's very comprehensive and it covers so many different aspects of fitness. But the gap comes, like you said, when you come to the logistical constraints of, one, giving people what they want, so that fun side of it, the entertainment side of it, the novelty side of it, and meeting their expectations. Like, people come in and some people expect to be doing Fran or something like that almost every day, Other people are thinking like lots of weightlifting, lots of gymnastics. So as a business, you have to give them what they want to at least a good extent. And secondly, the logistical constraints about space and equipment will definitely impact how you program your class because, yeah, like you said, you can't throw up a cargo net in most boxes and get people doing stuff like that. And we also have a library of exercises to choose from, which are thought of as standard CrossFit exercises. And people expect to do all of those with a reasonable frequency. So you might get members like, I haven't overhead squatted for 3 weeks. What's going on, coach? Why aren't we doing overhead squats? Or I haven't done a dumbbell overhead walking lunge for 3 weeks. So you kind of have to juggle all of these demands on the program to give enough of what people expect so that they're happy that you can run a good business. But also maybe it takes more, it's harder to be more creative, to think slightly outside the box of what the standard CrossFit programming is. And I think for me, when you're thinking about general physical preparedness, we've talked about this a lot in the past, it's much easier to be specific. Like it's much easier to program for CrossFit as a sport because we have a better idea of what's going to come up in the open, in the quarterfinals, in the semifinals, and eventually the games, because we've got past events as reference points for the types of things that can come up. But what's hard in a typical box or like a generic program is you don't know what the individual is going to do outside of the gym. And I think my perspective on people who are not competing in the sport of CrossFit is that the gym should facilitate what you want to do outside of the gym. So if you want to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if you want to play tennis, if you want to play golf, if you want to run, this training only serves the purpose to support that and make you resilient and fitter in those sports rather than making the gym-based exercise the goal in itself. I think it's Goodhart's law, which is something like when the metric becomes the goal, then it stops being a good metric. So if you're so focused on your back squat, we back squat because it makes our legs strong, which is useful in other things. But if all we care about is getting our back squat up, then we've kind of lost sight on what we're actually conditioning our body for. Say it's leg strength for jiu-jitsu. Once you've got a certain level of strength and a certain number of back squat, there's massively diminishing returns, and you're probably better served by a little bit more variety. And this was sort of brought to life for me recently when I did a muscle imbalance assessment on a good friend and listener, shout out Louis Towers, who is a very good CrossFitter. He's in the quarterfinals, so he's comfortably in the top 10% of CrossFitters globally. And there are some, I think he would agree, pretty shocking discoveries in the way that he moves. Like he's got very poor dorsiflexion, so his ankle range is very limited. His balance was very, very poor, and he couldn't do a side plank, which is pretty staggering considering he's so good at CrossFit, the sport. Like, he doesn't have any major holes in his CrossFit competitive performance. He recently squatted 183 kilos. He can do like huge unbroken sets in all of his gymnastics. His engine's decent. Like when you're looking at him as a CrossFit athlete, you're like, yeah, snatches over 100 kilos. Like this guy's good, but couldn't do a side plank. And he was experiencing some issues and pain, and his mobility was actually getting worse. So really struggling to get into a front rack, even though he is cleaning and front squatting regularly. So you think he's using that position. So it then begs the question, like he's doing a very good CrossFit program. Why is it that these certain aspects of his movement have actually probably got worse over time? And it's because he's specializing for the sport rather than training his body in what I would consider a more rounded way. Like if he wanted to do other things than CrossFit, he's probably over-investing in the CrossFit movements and under-investing in other movements. So I think today it'll be useful to explore what those gaps might be and how we can go about filling them. Before we get back to the podcast, a quick thank you to our show sponsor, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check out the website to get your free guide on 3 vital principles to movement mechanics. So if you're a coach, personal trainer, or manual therapist, there will be some useful tips to upgrade your practice.
Yeah, because to me, instantly, that he's following a program which gets him to the goal that he wants to achieve, which is to be good at CrossFit, which is exactly what a program is written to do, or the program that he's following to do. So there's nothing wrong with that side of things. So then when you say, okay, cool, is he ready for life? If that's not his goal, then obviously at this moment it's all right that he can't do these movements. But I think where the confusion comes, or where the worry comes, is when you've got, say, someone that's a bit more general public and they're performing CrossFit thinking that they're going to be ready for life, and there are these major gaps that are identified normally when they do something that's a little bit off plan. Like, you know, they might be wrestling with their kids, they might be trying to like run after a bus or some shit, and like you realize like, fuck, actually, when was the last time I sprinted like full, like all out, like fuck, the bus is gonna leave or the train's about to leave, you got to sprint for it. You're like, when was the last time your hamstrings have reacted that fast or anything? And like, no wonder like you go and tweak something. So I guess the first major gap when I think about CrossFit, from all the stuff that I've kind of learned from just obviously coaching it for a long time, but also then through like the mentorship and stuff, is triplanar movement. Like for me, thinking about the full 360 approach is in like, and this is not just CrossFit, this is training in the gym generally, like especially like with powerlifting, for what I've done, weightlifting, a lot of the time it is just up, down, maybe front and back, very rarely side to side if you're lucky, and rotation is a very, very rarity. So like the fact that this is a major gap in, say, CrossFit, what are those, how does that impact your, say, general well-being, but also what are some of the things that could be included within that kind of help that well-rounded approach?
Yeah, good question. And very good caveat as well that I think we need to make clear before we get into the details around his goal being to be a competitive CrossFitter. And that is something that everyone needs to decide in terms of how specialized do they want to be in going after being good at competitive CrossFit versus being a little bit more rounded, a little bit more of a having more movement options to do the other sports that they might do outside of the gym. And it's perfectly okay to be like, I'm going to go all in on CrossFit. That's going to be my sport. And I'm going to accept some deficiencies in other ways of moving because I want to invest all my eggs in the CrossFit basket. However, if you are more of a general health fitness enthusiast and you just want to do CrossFit to support your life outside of the gym, then your requirement for variety and your balance should shift more towards the things that we're about to talk about. Number one, of course, being triplanar movement. So like you said, we do a lot of up and down, we do a little bit of forward back, but we don't do much side to side and we don't do much rotation. So having done like hundreds and hundreds of assessments now, the patterns I see in CrossFitters, the first big one is that the frontal plane, so going side to side, is generally very poor. So compared to people who play other sports, CrossFitters typically don't move side to side in many of their joints very well. So the control of abduction and adduction of the hip is usually pretty shaky, and that can manifest either as very tight or very loose, very unstable. They're generally not great at side bending and controlling the shoulders in that frontal plane again, which Louis illustrated perfectly in that, you know, he is very strong with a barbell, but he could barely get his hips off the floor in a side plank. So that, side bending and stabilizing of the trunk in the frontal plane was very, very difficult. And what does that mean in terms of actual real world implications? I think it's something that's underappreciated, is that there's always an element of all three planes of motion in any normal movement. So even in walking or running, you are moving in the frontal planes. There's going to be an element of adduction and abduction of the hips. There's going to be an element of side bending through the spine. So if those movements get shut down, you end up missing out on muscle activation and the ability to perform those movements effectively. And you can see this in the examples we always give is if you look at powerlifters or weightlifters or CrossFitters run, they're generally very blocky and there's not much fluidity in how they run compared to an elite runner where they're just so fluid from shoulder to toe, everything is working together harmoniously. Whereas in these barbell athletes, there tend to be areas of massive stillness where they're missing out on muscles lengthening and shortening, which means they're missing out on activation and power from those areas of the body. So it's really important to get those, get that frontal plane moving if you care about anything. Well, if you care about walking effectively, if you care about running effectively, and you want to play any other sports, that is a huge part of moving effectively for them.
So I'm just trying to think, if someone was to try and incorporate these within their training, and even going as like basic as say a lateral, or I say basic, but go like lateral lunge, right? So a big step to the side. That could easily be implemented within your training, say as like a superset. So like as part of, say you're doing your squats and you do some lateral lunges as well. And, or you could have it as its own standalone thing and progressively overload it. So it's like, you can make it just like a normal strength exercise, but if it's not one of your main like KPIs, then go using it as a just your body weight, moving laterally, maybe adding in some rotation and stuff, then that's great. It's the exposure that we want to obviously get the body accustomed to, because if it never has to, it will become a glaring hole and a major gap in just how you move. And what you'll find, and this is from previous experience, like when I started to include a lot more lateral movement, a lot more rotation, what that enabled me to do is squat a lot more, because I felt a lot more stable in all my hips, rather than, I know if I suddenly buckled out of position slightly because of a slightly missed lift, I've been exposed to this kind of position before, because I've moved laterally, I've moved with some rotation, and I've accessed that part of the glute or that part of the hip before, and it's not an unknown. And I used to have quite a massive hip shift in my squat. And then obviously when that got corrected, like this is when it was become a major thing for me that I do include within all my training, because it really does plug that gap.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much a use it or lose it situation for movements. So this is how compensation patterns and how imbalances build up. Because if you never go sideways and you're never loading your muscles and your joints in that way, you will get very strong at using the joints in other ways. So predominantly sagittal plane. So if you're always just squatting up and down, you're never going side to side, your body will develop a strong preference for that movement pattern. So it'll always try and get back to that because it feels safe, it feels strong, and it is stronger in that direction. And over time, like any skill, you get rusty. So you get rusty at moving sideways, which means you become even more averse to going there. You're less likely to load those adductors like you would do in a side lunge. And you can get to the point where in your squat, you're barely using your adductors at all compared to even optimal squat mechanics for going up and down. And this is something I see a lot in CrossFitters, in that they've just done the same movement so many times that those movements themselves end up suffering because they've lost recruitment in those neighboring muscles. So it's, even if all you care about is competitive CrossFit and doing those standard movements, there's still a strong business case for including these lateral and frontal plane movements, because they will support the sagittal normal ones as well. And yeah, I think all exercises are arbitrary at the end of the day. Somebody's made them up. And normal free-flowing movement in life pre-gym was much more varied, was much more multi-directional, and that's kind of how we've evolved, with a much broader variety of stimuli on the body and on the skeleton. So almost like a little bit more, something that's one of the points we're going to make later, is just having a little bit more play and a little bit more freedom in how we move our body, rather than sticking strictly to these specific exercises. Because everybody should squat. Like, yeah, that is good for you, but squatting with even a lot of different variety in your squat, like moving around, loading from one side, twisting as you squat, shifting to one side as you squat. If you can do all of those things, you're actually going to be more robust for the real world than if you just squat up and down all day, every day.
This just made me think of when I dabbled into the world of old time strength, and I do want to kind of get back stuck into some of that stuff. Like when I'd done a lot of reading about how things used to be pre-gym, basically when training wasn't necessarily a normal thing and it was more of a circus act, that like the way the body's used to move through like severe spinal flexion, through severe side bending, severe rotation, and nowadays people are like just like no, you'll get hurt doing stuff like that. And it's like that was like when I was doing like one of the movements which I found was fascinating, was like called like the two hand anyhow. And it's a really stupid movement really, but it was fascinating because it's like you had to get a barbell that was loaded ideally up overhead. Then you have to pick up a kettlebell from in between your legs and touch the kettlebell to the barbell. So you've got two hands overhead with two different weights. And it's like the amount of like rotation, stability, everything was being challenged through this movement. And it was just like, if you look at nowadays, like say Instagram, essentially, that would be more of like, oh, what a stupid person. I don't know what they're doing. Da, 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 da. But then you go back 100 years, it's like, oh, fuck, look how strong that person is. It's just a completely different outlook. And it's just how training has changed. And I guess that kind of leads into like with our transverse stuff, because like the transverse plane, I think, is probably the least trained in a gym. I think it has to be trained less than side to side, I would say, because I think side to side, you at least oh no, I don't know actually. I'm just trying to think. I think they're both just massively undertrained. And I know, and this is not me saying, oh, I've been doing it, because I definitely haven't. Over the years, I've not done, like the most rotation I would do would be like a cable wood chop and like maybe a Russian twist, and like, you know what I mean? So like standard like core exercises, what we class as that would be how I would get my rotation. But now it's just, you realize when you are trying to think a little bit more, say, functionally or full body, like what does a transverse plane movement look like, and how is that gonna like benefit your training outside of just going up and down?
Yeah, so the transverse plane is the most powerful plane of motion. So if you think about any power movement in life or sport, like if you're throwing a ball, if you're hitting a ball in tennis or golf, or throwing a javelin, shot put, even running has a huge amount of transverse plane motion. So rotation is really, should be the main focus, I think, of any power and sport movements. So when we're in the gym, those are the classic transverse plane exercises that you mentioned earlier, stuff like Russian twists, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, and it's definitely better to have those in than not have them in. But as always, we'll come back to, what are we doing them for? Like, what parts of life outside of the gym are we training our rotation for? Is it for running? Are we looking to get nice rotation of the hips and the counter rotation of the thoracic spine to keep us aligned whilst loading the muscles really effectively to create lots of propulsion? Are we training the rotation to hit a ball in tennis, to hit a ball in golf? Like, we can be more or less specific to our sporting goals, but as long as we have stimulation of those joints in those directions, as we said earlier, if you use it, you won't lose it. And the gap for me is we do so much bracing and counter rotation work. So a lot of people think the best core training is counter rotation, where we're training our body to be still. And there is a place for that if you're like a strong man, or you need to brace hard and avoid crumpling to big forces. But really, we should be training the ability to move rather than to not move. And in all of these sports and all of these movements, the ability to create force in the transverse plane is really what we're after, which requires going from rotating one way to rotating the other way. So that should be a massive focus of what we're trying to do. So even just like one of my favorite exercises for general rotation would be a standing Russian twist, where you can go in a staggered stance. So say right foot's forward, left foot's back, and you're twisting over the right foot. So your hips are turning left and your spine is turning right, and you're creating what we call separation. So you're out of sync between the pelvis and the shoulder girdle. So you get lots of lengthening in that transverse plane across the trunk. And that is a huge source of power in all of the movements that we just talked about, even in running. But if you think about hitting a ball in tennis, that's where a huge amount of force comes from. Golf, even like wrestling, if you're trying to throw somebody over your hip, that's where a lot of the power will come from. And there's very little exposure to that in CrossFit. And one of the patterns you see is that people have become so good at bracing under the barbell, their thoracic spines don't rotate much at all. Like whenever I'm assessing somebody, especially people with shoulder issues, you'll quite often see almost zero rotation through their thoracic spine. Once you block out the hips and they can't contribute any rotation from the hips, the spine doesn't rotate nearly at all. And it's very, very common. And I just think in terms of general function, that's not a good thing. If you're a barbell athlete, it can be helpful. If you are a prop forward in rugby, there's a good case for stiffness through the spine. But for somebody looking to play tennis on the weekends or who likes going for a run, I think having the option of movement there is always going to trump having just a rock solid iron rod of a spine.
Well, you say that, but I know you're going to say, well, yeah, but when I think about, say, a heavy back squat or something like that, and when you are towards your top end, there may be some torso rotation, because the thing is, especially as you're going to favor one side, so you might have a bit more of a dominant, say, right side. So what you'll find is the bar will start to twist to the left. So the left side will start to pull backwards. So if you've already trained that position, just like I mentioned with like the lateral, moving laterally, like if you've trained and expose yourself to the hip shift, you've trained and exposed yourself to the rotation, these are not unknown things. So you're more likely, if your sport is to perform an up and down movement like a squat, then like having that exposure. And the way I like to think of it as is like using like the towel analogy of thinking like, how easy is it to say rip a towel compared to if you twist the towel right up, that towel becomes like unbreakable essentially. Like how, and if you're thinking about that rotation and how much more say you can create tension, like I think it's there's such, as you said, it's being like one of the most powerful planes. It's like we're missing out on this because we're not doing it, and it's like it needs to be incorporated. So beyond just so like a standing Russian twist, what other say gym based movements could you start to do that might be a bit more say functional, that might carry over a little bit more say to CrossFit? I know I've just put you on the spot there and you have to quickly pull out those exercise libraries, but what other exercises could we start to include? Before we get back to the podcast, don't forget to click the link in the description below to register your interest and get Lunge and Lift listener exclusive bonuses for the Strength Formula, your answer to the strength and muscle building equation.
Yeah, so the way I would think about it is, if you have a specific sport in mind, then it's very easy. You want to do something that looks a little bit like that sport. So if you have access to a cable, you want to play tennis, you can recreate shots using a cable with a little bit of resistance, just so you're getting a stretch reflex from a similar position. But in terms of real simple ones that anyone can do with any or limited kits, the rotating lunge is a great one. So when we do a 3-way lunge, you've got normal forward lunge, normal side lunge, and then a rotating lunge, where the key is that we're getting so if you imagine you're starting with both feet at 12 o'clock on a clock face, if you're stepping your right foot out and around, you want it to about 4:30. So either to 90 degrees, which is sort of the basic variation, or if you go all the way around to 135 degrees on that clock face, you're getting a lot of rotation through the hips. And if you're turning your torso as well, you can get some separation through the movement. But any variation where you're creating that out of sync nature between the pelvis and the shoulders. So this is a classic gym exercise which I think can be done very well. If you do a forward lunge with a twist over the forward leg, that creates separation. So even those basic things do help, and they do keep some stimulation to the movement patterns through the spine. I think those would be the places where I start. And if you wanted to go a little bit more helpful for the ballistic nature of those power sport movements, then just doing plate swings, it's a classic warm up, just arm circles and standing twists, those sorts of things. There's a reason why so many athletes still do those. You'll always see swimmers warming up their shoulders like that. You'll see a lot of throwing athletes, like base pitchers, they'll warm up like that. And there's a reason. It's preparing the body for that demand. Tennis players will do it as well. And if you wanted to load them up, you can hold like a really lightweight, literally like 500 grams to like even 2.5 kilos would be too much for most people to be doing those arm swings where you're throwing one arm behind you. So you'll get a big pec stretch as well as turning the trunk. And then you can throw it around the other way to get rear delt, rhomboids, back of the shoulder, activated as well. But I think the key there is that we're moving the thoracic spine with the shoulder at the same time. So we're getting rotation of the trunk. It's not just the shoulder that's doing all the work, which is actually what leads to a lot of injuries. Because the spine doesn't move, the shoulder has to do extra work.
And how much hip movement are you having in that as well? Are you trying to keep the hips still, so you're mainly keeping it within the spine and the shoulder, or are you trying to allow a full body rotation essentially to open up and then to close off?
Generally speaking, I'd have everything working together, because that's how the body would like to work in function. If you're hitting a tennis ball, you want to lead from the ground up. So you would step into the shot, throw the foot out, then turn the hips, then turn the chest, then hit the ball with your hand. The more joints that move, the more muscles come in and the more potential power you have to put into the shot. Only if there was a restriction would I try to tweak joints in and joints out. So if somebody was super stiff through the spine, then I might block the hips so they can't trick you into thinking you've got more rotation than you can. So one of the assessments I'll do in a muscle imbalance assessment is I'll get them to do standing rotation. So feet together, hands out in front, turn left and right. And most people will get to about 90 degrees so they can face the side wall on either side. But the interesting thing comes out when you block the hips. So you get one foot to step over the other and just turn over. So we essentially take the hips out of the equation and we can see how much comes from just the spine. And this is where you'll see a lot of these CrossFit athletes have absolutely zero. So they can't turn over that front foot. So they think they've got loads of rotation, but actually all that rotation is coming from the lower body and none of it's coming from the spine. And in those situations, exactly, yeah, you can trick yourself into thinking you can rotate, but the body is incredible as a system, right? It will solve the problem some way that it can. But what we're looking for is what areas of the body are doing too much, more than their fair share, and which areas of the body are not. And if you've got a thoracic spine that does not rotate, you're missing out on a lot of muscle activation that could be happening if the thoracic spine rotated, and you would get a more even distribution of workload, which would mean those local hotspots don't get overloaded so much. So if somebody presented like that, then we'd be looking for ways to get the spine rotating without the other body parts picking up their slack and hiding them from the movement that we're trying to get out of them.
So that leads nicely on to previous show guests that we've had on, McInnes Watson, when he spoke about Plyos, and something which I've always kind of like foolishly, I guess, thought is, okay, well, I do some Plyos, I do box jumps. And obviously realizing a lot recently that that isn't really plyometric, as in like where we can start to really see some gains. And since he's been on, obviously I've been working along with Chris Speed as well, so I've been doing a lot of plyos there, and realizing what plyometrics actually are and how they can then obviously start to benefit training. Because I reckon if you ask a CrossFitter, what plyometrics do you do in your training? Well, I do box jumps, but I want to obviously put a caveat here. So if you're doing, say, box jump overs or something like that, where you are reacting to a force, so you're landing and jumping over, or you're doing rebound box jumps and, like, say, double unders, there is plyometrics in CrossFit. But do you do any plyometric specific work, and how can you start to incorporate it? And so I guess my real question here is the fact that this is quite a major gap within CrossFit, that there isn't loads of plyometrics. How is that going to affect an athlete, essentially?
Yeah, so I think plyometrics are probably the most underrated component of training at the moment. And the reason is, if you look at the nature of most real life or sporting movements, they're very plyometric. So whatever sport you're playing, if it involves moving around, you generally want to be bouncy, fast, reactive, and agile. You don't want to be just flat-footed and static. So when we train most of our strength and power production just being fixed to one spot, we're training stillness again rather than movement and motion. So I think adding in more plyometric movement, specifically locomotive, like moving yourself forwards or backwards, obviously triplanar as well, side to side and rotating, we're replicating, training, and progressing the real life demands of movement. Like if you play any sport, being faster is better. Like if you have the
Yeah.
option to be faster, you have a massive competitive advantage. The other thing that plyometrics are great for is movement efficiency and economy. Matt made the point really well on our podcast when he came on, was that even if you're like an endurance runner, if you can be a little bit faster off the ground and you can get a little bit more distance per step, that's you being faster,
Yeah.
taking the same number of steps.
Yeah.
And especially with tenderness, strength, and force production, it's almost free energy because it's much more elastic. It doesn't require as much muscle contraction. So you're getting almost free power and force production. So I think the other element to this is recreating the dynamic nature of sport and reactivity. So if you think about how a lot of injuries happen, if somebody, I don't know, rolls their ankle or somebody does their ACL playing football, they've basically gone into a position at speed that they don't have the reactive control to decelerate and return from safely. And plyos are much closer to doing that. If you're doing lateral bounds, you're getting your joints moving in all three planes of motion, moving into and out of potentially injurious positions and training the skill to come back safely. So that is a much better way to prepare for the highly variable number of positions you could hit in sport and build up tissue tolerance, because you need that graded exposure so that all aspects of your system of a body can level up against them. And I think for me, that's how we should be conditioning our body for those demands. And it's not dissimilar to the ballistic point we were just making before. Those high speed dynamic movements are more of the movements that we perceive as higher risk, but they're also the most useful and actually beneficial movements in sports. So for me, we should be putting a lot more emphasis on that and a lot less emphasis on slow strength.
And then I guess if you're trying to find, you could be saying, well, I've got all these things that start added in. I've not got time to do all these things. Trying to find movements that incorporate all these things. Like, for instance, one of the plyos that I've been doing recently has basically been like a jump lunge with a med ball, like in a way throw over the leg that's forward. So I'm getting the transverse, I'm getting that, and the separation as well, because I'm coming over and down. I'm getting the plyometric. I'm doing the unilateral work. I'm traveling because I'm not that good at it. So I'm moving a little bit sideways and stuff like that. I'm getting that. So I'm doing so much in one movement, and I absolutely love it and also coordination. Like, it was embarrassing. I picked up a 6 kilo wall ball thinking I'm about to do it with that. And I was like, I can't. So then picked up a 3 and I was like, I can't. I had to put it down, use my hand and understand how to move from side to side. Then I added the load because I just expected myself to be able to do it. And until you put yourself into the scenario to actually do some of these things, it's like, okay, when am I ever going to be doing this jump lunge? You're not necessarily going to be doing it. But it's all the little bits that I'm exposing my body to that my body might be exposed to part of that. And because I've done this, it's an easy way to incorporate within, say, a warm-up. And it has been such a game changer for how springy I felt in my weightlifting in such a short time. Even though I haven't been feeling amazing, I've learned and got better at it so much quicker from doing a lot of these plyos, and my joints do what made my hips and my knees do feel really good for them.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say you're never going to be doing that movement, but if we think about any sort of sport, any sort of change of direction, that movement
I don't play sport.
better replicates. You don't play sports. You need to change that, mate.
I know.
But if you change direction, like if you're running, even if you're doing a shuttle run,
I'm
CrossFit,
joking, mate.
right?
I know.
But I know. But I'm just making the point that for the listeners, it can look a bit silly, but if you look at it, take a step back and look at it, it actually looks more similar to the real world way that you use your body. Like if you look at somebody change direction when they're sprinting or playing sport, it's going to look a lot more like a jump lunge lateral bound with a med ball reach over the leg than it is most of the things we do in the gym. And baked into that, there's so many brilliant movement qualities that you touched on there, in that you're having to reactively stabilize ankles, knees, hips, spine, shoulders all together, and coordinate yourself to move in a specific direction and come out with power. So it's like bang for buck. It's a brilliant exercise.
Oh yeah, no, and that's why I've said it's something that even beyond the weightlifting competition, I'm going to keep within my training anyway, because it's like I love it, because it, and same as like even been doing things like I say, like from a kneeling position to then obviously like jump into bounding and stuff like that, or moving laterally. It's been really fun. And for me, that's the part of training which, as like we've spoken about before, we do need to incorporate more fun, but it's just really hard, especially if you're within a group environment. And to incorporate that, because you need space and you need like to coach, say like 20 people into a plyometric jump, like I say, a kneeling jump to bound to leap to lateral, like fuck, that'd be an absolute shit show. But I think like when it comes to like odd objects, like these are the sort of things like for me where odd objects are fun. Like it's a very real life appropriate and applicable movements. And I always refer back to like carrying D-balls, sandbags and stuff like that, to when I carried the double oven out of my kitchen. It's like, when have I ever trained to carry the double oven out at the kitchen? I haven't, but I have trained heavy sandbag walks. I've trained heavy this and heavy that, because I'm a big fan of using your full body as one unit rather than necessarily always isolating it, and like into say like more of a bodybuilding aspect. And like when I say like full body, it's like you can say, well, we do that in CrossFit, and it's like you do a hell of a lot of full body movements, but how many of these full body movements are more than one plane at one time? And that's where like with you got to think, when I'm carrying a double oven, I'm not going to be this like brace static like walk. I'm just not. There's going to be some lean, there's going to be some rotation when I'm going to go around corners, putting it into a skip. Do you know what I mean? There's so much that can go wrong if I only trained up and down.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've spoken about this before, but strongman stuff, I think, is more functional than traditional strength training and barbell stuff, in that in real life, if you're picking up something heavy, the chances of it being symmetrically loaded, perfectly balanced, and in the middle of your stance, perfectly over your feet, is very unlikely. Even if you're a parent and you're picking up your child out of the cot, like you have to lean over, so already you're picking up the weight from away from your center of balance, so you're in a air quotes like bad position for how we would coach a deadlift or something like that. You're probably not going to pick them up straight on, and they're definitely not evenly weighted from head to toe. So there's all these extra variables just from picking up a child, and they're not even that heavy for a baby. So when we're training in the gym, if we can better replicate that, we're going to be more resilient against movements like that. And I've heard a few clients complain about this sort of thing when I start working with them, is that they throw their back out picking up their child, but they can deadlift 100 kilos. Your kid doesn't weigh 100 kilos. So maybe we shouldn't just be doing strict deadlifts. If you want to be more able to do the things you want to do or need to do in life, then having the variety and adding in that triplanar object stuff, I think, is brilliant.
And I think if we're trying to put this into the practical application, as in obviously it is a major gap in CrossFit most of the time in the class-based model, because of the practicality of having all the kit, having all the stuff to actually do this kind of bits. But if we were able to kind of create an odd object, maybe it's not, rather than an odd object, it might just be holding a like kettlebell in a slightly odd way. So you might be holding it out in front of you while you're doing a carry. So rather than holding it on you close to your center mass, you're holding it away from you. You're holding it maybe overhead or out to the side slightly. Like, odd objects is more than just the object itself, which sounds silly, but it's doing things differently, or using things that are different. Doesn't always mean a different tool. So because most gyms have kettlebells, they have dumbbells, they have all these like very conventional objects. So it's about basically looking odd doing it, will probably benefit you more than the actual, okay, it needs to be a sandbag.
Yeah.
Or because how odd is a sandbag or D-ball? Really, it's not. Or like a yoke.
Yeah.
That's not odd. It's just essentially you're carrying something. So it's just
Yeah.
how can you make carrying something a little bit more awkward to carry over to real life?
Yeah. It's almost like deliberately bad form is the way to
Yeah.
think about it, is that you're
Old time
breaking the
strength,
normal
mate.
convention. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking of, you can almost make a, the old, in the cartoon when there's a human chain passing buckets of water, you could almost do that like as a warm up to just, pass a dumbbell down the line,
Yeah.
pass a med ball down the line, pass a box down the line, whatever it is. Like, you're using your strength in different directions and having to stabilize unusually balanced item. And I
Yeah.
think that's really what we use our strength for in real life.
Yeah, or even like I'm just thinking then using that, like even if you had a partner where you both standing back to back and you gradually take a little bit more of a step away from each other and you try to say do like a standing Russian twist, pass it to the person behind you, and then you reach the other side. So like that's a nice easy way to then do it with a partner. So or if you had like a band attached to the rig and you could there is so much room for experimentation and exploring positions, and I think it's because especially within a class environment where you're normally bound by time and so you're looking for effective, what most people will enjoy and find, okay, this is going to work. It can be really easy to stick to the basic fundamentals that we know rather than actually broadening that horizon and thinking the fundamentals are more than just up and down. Like there is a lot more movement, and I think that kind of carries into nicely our next part, which is like with zone 2, because obviously what like great episode that you did, zone 2 one, and the amount of essentially time that's needed to get the benefits from zone 2 is what deters most people from doing it, because most people are already pushed on time and they're thinking, I want to get the most bang for my buck, so I need to be doing a lot more bigger movements. So I need to be getting like these big, like say a thruster, because that's going to give me more rather than sitting on a bike doing 60 minutes of zone 2.
Yeah, and there's a lot of truth in that. I think that's one of the great strengths of CrossFit. With people who are just doing exercise for health and fitness or as a hobby, generally they work a full-time job and have to get the most bang for buck and return on the time invested. So CrossFit is very effective in terms of what results it can get you in the amount of time that you put in, because of the high intensity, because of the compound movements. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that at all, but it is a potential gap in the typical way that the CrossFit methodology is applied. And like you say, no one's going to pay their CrossFit membership, turn up and just do 60 minutes on the C2 bike. They're not going to feel like they've got their value for money. So I'm not suggesting that that's the way we should go about it. But I think definitely pushing people to try and do it in their own time. So whether they turn up early, just sit on the bike for 20 minutes before class, I think the best way to do it is almost make a social thing out of it. Like you might just catch up with somebody both sitting on the bike, because you're supposed to stay conversational anyway. You might go for a really slow jog or a hike or something like that, as part of your lifestyle. And some places do this brilliantly. Like I know there's a lot of gyms that have clubs outside of the gym to get members meeting up away from class and doing this sort of stuff. But I think, definitely check out the episode with Sean from Upside Strength that we did on zone 2, because he explains it much better than I can. But there's a huge amount of benefit to be derived even for your high intensity performance. That will benefit from doing more zone 2 work. But I think for the general athlete, from a health perspective, this is something that most people would benefit from building in, adding in a cycle to work. If you have the option, just more low intensity movement is almost always better. Before we get back to the podcast, a quick thank you to our sponsor, WIT-fitness.com. Please use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off all of your WIT kit.
Quickly, while I've got you here, before we get back to the podcast, we just want to thank Hytro, our show sponsor, for our blood flow restriction apparel. If you want to get some discount there, you can use the code LL20 for 20% off. So I guess we now need to put this into some practical takeaways, because obviously we've kind of alluded to them throughout, but
Mm.
I think a lot of these exercises or movements or like ways of like planes of movement need to be incorporated one way or another, and we are all pushed on time. So finding ways to maybe add them in your warm-ups or as accessories, or maybe tweaking accessories that you're already doing to then encompass these movements, like the warm-ups. I know most people will probably do, say, a walk-in lunge, say, to warm up, because it's a nice locomotive exercise that'll kind of get the whole body moving. And it's, I'm using that as my own example, because I use that a hell of a lot, because I love it as an exercise to do a lot of things at once. But what you can then do is, just like I mentioned earlier with that plyometric lunge, jump lunge, where I'm on the spot, popping around, twisting, I'm getting so much done. So instead of the walking lunge, I choose to do that instead. Or I do half the amount of walking lunges, then I do the other half of reps as this plyo jump lunge. So it's just a thing. Or if I'm then going into, say, my accessories, I might say turn a dumbbell shoulder press into a dumbbell shoulder press with a rotation. So I'm still, or I might have it with a like lateral flex of the spine. So I'm going to then start to incorporate some of these more unconventional movements instead of my press, because we have to ask, why am I doing, say, a dumbbell shoulder press? Is it to, say, get my overhead pressing strength up? Well, then what am I actually trying to get stronger? Am I trying to improve my barbell overhead strength, or am I just improving my overhead strength in general? If it's just my overhead strength in general, then adding some of these like a lateral flex or a rotation in will help that, because it's going to expose you to different positions, so I'll be a more well-rounded individual. However, even though it's going to improve my barbell overhead press, the specificity isn't necessarily fully there. So I should be doing the barbell overhead press to get me stronger at that particular movement, because that's what I want to get stronger at, because that's my measure. And then as my accessory, which is what accessories should be, would then be, say, the dumbbell press with the lateral flexion or the rotation.
Yeah, exactly. I think doing the triplanar stuff in the warm up, everything we said earlier about improving muscle activation, it's going to put you in a great state to then do your main lifting. Like if you're doing triplanar lunges, you're doing triplanar jump lunges, you then go into your squat. Everyone says they feel amazing, like their hips have been mobilized and stabilized, and all the muscles would be far more activated than just doing a bunch of air squats, even if you tweak the foot positions, which is still a good warm up. But I think if you're looking to keep your members engaged, give them a bit of novelty, and get them feeling good, and have a very effective warm up, that's a very simple and obvious place to build them in. But as Rob touched on there, having them in as your accessories is a great way to get ahead of any of these compensation patterns and imbalances. So let's take that example we saw earlier of the adductors not working very well in a squat. If your accessories include sumo squats, if they include side lunges as standards, then you're getting ahead of that situation before it has a chance to bed in. So having a little bit more variety in those movements puts us in a great place overall, and actually long term will probably lead to better progress. Only if you're looking to peak for a CrossFit competition is there really a case to trim those things out. But I think for most people, most of the time, almost as much variety as possible in the accessories will serve them better than just hammering away on the same movement patterns.
Yeah, and I think what you kind of touched on earlier and what we've spoken about before is having more play within your training, as in that could be in the form of sport, or having a bit more like multi-directional warm-ups. So just like we said there about how to do, say, like lunges, but if you want to actually make it a bit more fun and a bit more like play like, you know, you could have like, say, shuttle runs where you're running, you're rotating, you're touching, you can only touch the floor facing one direction, so you have to then do it like all those sort of things. They sound really basic, but we don't do them because they're so basic, and because there's now you need to be doing this to warm up for that, and it's like, well, you're right, you should be doing some of these like quite standard, say, movements to, say, warm up a squat, But how about doing it a little bit different? And that's like, and I think like what you said there about doing like a sumo squat. So if we already do air squats, say as a primer for some squatting, do some air squats, then go straight into some sumo squats. Like even if you don't have a wide stance squat, again, getting them primed, getting them turned on, ready for the barbell squat, which means when they might need to become a little bit more active in your squat, they've already been switched on, they've already been primed and prepped, ready for the work ahead.
Yeah, spot on. And I think I would always encourage people to play more sports in all situations. Like if you're a competitive CrossFitter, that's a sport, you're competing in that. But it's not just the competitive side of it, it's the fun side of it. You just enjoy almost like the fruits of your labor. If you've developed a lot of fitness, you should put it to use. And that doesn't mean just ending yourself on a workout to see where your capacity is at. It's almost just enjoying it's the same idea as just going for a leisurely run. Just actually make use of the
ability
that
to
you
run.
have.
Yeah, the fact you
Yeah,
get to
exactly.
run, not the fact you have to run.
Exactly. And I think that concept sometimes gets lost when we get so deeply into training, because we're just like, training is the goal itself. It's like, no, training should support the things that you want to do with your body, full stop. And that can be just going for a hike, not emptying the tank, just taking in some nice scenery. I would think that's something that we don't spend enough of our time and attention on, because really that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and then I guess you have to understand the balance between the competitive side of fitness and general fitness. And obviously, where you are on that spectrum is if you are competitive within, say, CrossFit or some sort of functional fitness, then you are going to have to be a lot more specific to your movements. You are going to have to probably be a lot more sagittal in a lot of this stuff. Like if you want to get good at a barbell thruster, you have to do a barbell thruster. So we do need to get very specific. But if you don't care about being so competitive, I think we need to try and take away the need to watch things like A Decade of Fitness on Netflix and then be like, I want to do that, so I now need to do chest to bar pull-ups, I need to do toes to bar, I need to do muscle ups, I need to do all these like high overhead walking lunges. Why do you need to do an overhead walking lunge? For me, it's like whenever that exercise gets programmed for me, I'm just like, the risk reward for most people is just not worth it, because most people cannot hold a weight overhead in that position anyway. So just hold a front rack. I know it's a little side tangent, but it's just whenever I see that as an exercise, I'm just like, because I know how hard it is. And it's like, for most people, they're just not going to be getting the right stimulus. So why not choose a better stimulus for the general public that are not competitive? Because they don't need to be able to do an overhead walking lunge. They might need to do an overhead carry, very different. But an overhead walking lunge, the demand is so much higher. It's just, if you're not competitive, just the risk reward has to be taken into account.
100%. And I think I'm almost going to contradict myself here in that,
brilliant,
for me, a competitive athlete, a competitive CrossFitter just needs the minimum necessary movement variety to stop them getting injured. At the end of the day, they should be putting all their resources into getting as good as possible at the sport of CrossFit, and just adding in enough of this stuff to facilitate that. Like, they are not getting measured on their side lunge. They're not getting measured on their rotating lunge. They're getting measured on their classic CrossFit workouts. They're getting measured on whatever the tests at the games will be. So it's just enough to unlock the maximum performance in those specific dimensions. But for the rest of us, we have other demands on our body. We have other priorities for how we want to move and why we want to move. So that should be top of our priority list, not getting good at the sport of CrossFit, which there is an inflection point where, as we talked about for Louis earlier, you go beyond a certain level and you can become over specialized for the CrossFit standard movements at the expense of movements outside of the gym, which is not what we want. We're trying to get people as physically competent outside of the gym. That's the ultimate reason why most people are training. And having that clear in your mind means you can view programming decisions with a lot more perspective as to, like you say, do we really need to be overhead walking, lunging, is that really serving me outside of the gym, or could I be spending my time a little bit more effectively by doing a standing Russian twist, for example? And for a lot of people, they probably would.
Yeah, I mean, and this is we want to be very clear. Like, this is definitely not a bash on CrossFit, because this is kind of a bash on training in the gym in general. And
Yep.
it's just because we've gone from one extreme where I think training used to be a little bit more sporty and stuff like that before the gym became a thing. So it was people playing sports, people being active. Then it become very much gym based, like say bodybuilding. Everything led from bodybuilding. Everything needed to be like isolated and stuff like that. Then what a functional fitness come in with CrossFit, really like taking the forefront there. And so you have CrossFit, which kind of brought this in, and they spoke about getting outside. They said about playing sports. They said about, moving in multiple directions. But the problem is, commercially, that doesn't make sense. And you then have to do the outside the box stuff, like you mentioned today, like zone 2 with friends, or like outside like run club, or like strength club outside, like going to the forest and picking up trees and shit. Like, do you know what I mean? It's doing stuff that's different, but that then most people only want to get strong or be like gym fit either before work or after work, or maybe on their lunch break, to then spend the weekend being fit. Normally they have other life things that are going to take priority, so then they have to make sure when they're in the gym that they're getting some of this exposure. So I understand, like, these discrepancies are going to appear, because that's just part of training, especially when you, as you said there, like with specializing. As soon as you start to specialize, like, other things are probably going to fade off a little bit, because you haven't got the time necessary to do everything. But if you're getting really good at your sport, then sweet, keep doing you. But make sure you understand that if you don't include some of these other movements, you're going to be leaving something on the tank, because something on the table, because the chance of injury then increases. Because as you get further and further away from that imbalance being just a little bit to then being a glaring issue, as soon as you then go slightly out of whack and that imbalance becomes a glaring problem, then your training suffers and the training drops down. So just by adding in these little things more often, will really start to encompass a wider ability to be able to perform multiple tasks for more.
Yeah, I think, I want to echo that thought, in that I'm still a massive fan of CrossFit. I still think it's amongst the best GPP programs out there, and there's more movement variety in CrossFit than in most other training methodologies. But the reason I think this is a really productive conversation is that as an industry in fitness, we should always be looking to do the best job we can. And if the mandate is general physical preparedness and functional fitness to support life outside of the gym, we should be constantly challenging our assumptions and challenging the way that we break down the body into movement types. And I think adding in a few of these concepts as a bigger proportion of the movements that we use in training will have people actually generally physically prepared better. And so everyone wins. And I think CrossFit, every year they do iterate, they add new movements in. But I think if they added movements in these directions, it would really keep it at the forefront of generally physically preparing people, because it is still the go-to. Like, if you think about a GPP methodology, it's still the first one that people think of. So I hope somebody at CrossFit HQ listens, and if you want any help upgrading the program, I'm here for you. But I think there's a lot of good stuff happening, and this is just our 2 cents on where we'd like to see it go.
So if you've got some 2 cents to add to this conversation, we would love to hear them. Don't forget to share this episode on your social medias and add your 2 cents there. Maybe say you guys are chatting a load of shit and you don't know what you're talking about. We would love to hear that opinion, and we would then be able to give a little bit of a rebuttal. But hopefully we've had quite an in-depth conversation in non-bias, and you've kind of been able to pull some practical takeaways to maybe think to include within your training, or maybe if you have some gaps in your training, are you able to fill them? And if you are, what's going to be your most bang for buck that's going to give you a wider range of essentially ability to do more in life. So as always, thank you very much for listening. Really do appreciate you guys every week, and we really appreciate the growth of the podcast that only comes from you guys heading over to YouTube, subscribing to the YouTube channel, sharing the episodes. We really, really do appreciate it. So as always, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.